Hi everybody, it's a pleasure to be with you virtually today. My name's Glenn and I'm a Senior Lecturer and Research Fellow at the University of Western Australia. Today I'm going to be examining and problematising contemporary debates in favour of what is known as policy alignment. And I'm going to be thinking about this concept of policy alignment, particularly in relation to federal systems like the US and like Australia, where the concept of alignment or practices of alignment are frequently offered as solutions to a whole range of different policy problems. The talk I want to give today is based on an article that's just been released in the Journal of Education Policy, which I co-authored with Kate O'Connor. And it emerges out of a 3-year Australian Research Council project that I have, which has been looking at how national schooling reforms are reshaping relationships between governments in the Australian Federation. So it's really about the impact of national reform on the reshaping of federal systems. And I've got a particular interest in how state-level bureaucrats are interpreting and responding to national reform. Now, I'll say more about that project in a minute, but before I went into that bigger project, I was already interested in debates about policy alignment. You know, I was interested in what this concept means. But as I began to do this bigger project, I got more and more interested in the concept and how it was being spoken about. As part of the project, I interviewed more than 70 policy actors, senior policy actors, both in Australia and also internationally. And nearly half of these were located within education departments and agencies within 4 case study Australian states. So I looked at New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and my own state of Western Australia. Now, when I was doing these interviews, I was really struck by how frequently ideas and issues concerning this concept of alignment were raised by the policy actors I interviewed. So terms like policy alignment, policy misalignment, and also associated concepts like harmonisation seem to be really high on the minds of these bureaucrats, especially those people who are kind of deeply engaged in implementing the vast number of standards-based reforms that have emerged in Australia over the past decade. As part of the project, I also spent some time in Paris at the OECD. And at the OECD, this saturation of dialogue around alignment continued. When I was there, the OECD had recently released 2 reports on governing complex education systems. And in both of them, the idea of greater alignment between various policy actors, organisations, and processes, these things were positioned as central to building successful education systems. So following what interpretive researchers call an abductive method, I essentially started to open up a dialogue between my interviews on the one hand and theoretical and policy analysis on the other hand. And these forms of data kind of became intertwined in an iterative process of interpretation, reinterpretation, and so on, with my key aim really being to better understand, to define, to get at what this thing is called policy alignment, but to also understand how policy actors are interpreting and engaging with imperatives to align policies in the Australian Federation. So to start with, what is policy alignment? What am I talking about when I say that? And also, why is it important, as I'm arguing, to problematise alignment, particularly within federal systems? So if we take a step back, the past few decades, and you'd probably be well aware of this, the past few decades have seen arguments emerge in policy that, you know, as kind of the pressures of globalisation intensify, governments are under increasing pressure to deal with what is often called wicked policy problems. These are policy problems that are either very complex or they cut across traditional political boundaries. And so in schooling, there is seen to be a lot of these problems. So we hear about equity, student performance, teacher quality. These are just some of the kind of bright light examples in schools. We're often told that, if we could do more policy sharing, more collaboration, and even co-design policies across systems, this would help address some of these complex issues and would also help promote enhanced policy learning through the cross-pollination of evidence-informed ideas and practices. So to cut a long story short, let's bring governments together, let's bring stakeholders together around the evidence that tells us what works, and in many cases, let's develop standards-based reforms that are grounded in that evidence. So you've probably heard that kind of argument before. So very closely related to that is an interest in how new forms of policy alignment can be forged both within and across interdependent systems to ensure the efficient and effective implementation of those evidence-based reforms. So arguments in favour of alignment nearly always frame the misalignment of policy goals, policy processes, or policy content as problems leading to waste, inefficiencies, and poor outcomes. So the solution is seen to lie in the enhanced alignment of these elements to ensure those evidence-based reforms can have maximum impact. And in doing so, the arguments for alignment, that they typically rest on an assumption, I argue, that greater commonality, greater commensurability, and harmonisation of policies, they see these as intrinsically positive features that will drive improvement. And this, again, as I said, not only leads to arguments in favour of things like standards-based reforms, but it also leads to arguments in favour of enhanced data interoperability, common goals and metrics, and also the development of common evidence repositories to inform practice. So, as a sociologist and also as a researcher of federalism, I'm really fascinated by what I see as a heightened interest in the apparent merits of policy alignment. And in particular, I'm interested in how alignment is offered as a solution to so-called perennial problems within federal systems, such as policy fragmentation, too much diversity across systems, or conflicts or inconsistencies between states, and also broader attempts to achieve policy coherence within a federation. So if we look at a system like the US, there's been particular interest in policy alignment since the era of the No Child Left Behind Act, which had a central focus on aligning state curricular and assessment processes to requirements of the Federal Act. And so scholars who've argued in favour of alignment have framed No Child Left Behind as a rich opportunity for tackling the incoherence and fragmentation of American federalism through better aligning federal and state agendas. And they've also argued that doing so will improve outcomes and that doing so is an essential ingredient for making standards-based reforms work coherently. So we have people like Jeanette Looney, for example. She's argued that the core logic of standards-based reform really rests upon policy alignment. And she says, this should involve both technical alignments, that is between, say, curricular content, assessments, metrics, measures of success, and so on, but also social alignments, which she means like the alignments between systems, different actors, organisations, processes, and so on, with the idea that people should sort of look to work cooperatively towards shared values and goals and so on. And so we've seen a number of other US scholars who've made very similar arguments, arguing that alignment is the primary means for achieving policy coherence in K-12 education. It's important to note, though, that arguments in favour of policy alignment are not unique to federal systems, but are seen as relevant to all nations seeking to govern schooling in so-called complex times. So in the paper that has just been released, Kate and I argue, we signal, I guess, what we call a critical conceptual interest in alignment. So we're particularly interested in unpacking how both alignment and misalignment are made visible as policy solutions and policy problems. And also we're interested in what current debates leave out of the policy problematic. So to put that differently, what I've been trying to do is ask the question, when we argue for policy alignment, what kinds of considerations, preferences, and potential solutions are being privileged and what's been obscured from view? So as political scientists Christopher Ansell and Robert Geyer have argued, problems in policy are themselves problematic. They're not taken for granted, they're always contested. And it's important to problematize those processes of problem setting and problem definition. And doing that, I think, allows us to really interrogate the politics of policy and also the extent to which problem-solution dynamics often gloss over tensions and complexities to make both the problem and the solution appear far more coherent than is often the case. So I guess as part of this process of problematizing alignment, I've come to sort of see that it actually takes very little effort to see that arguments in favour of alignment, on the one hand, sort of construct the policy problem in a way that grates really uncomfortably against both what we might call the design and the principles underpinning federations. Indeed, I've started to question whether, at its core, alignment might be anathema to federalism. And this is because, debates in favour of alignment tend to rest on a number of assumptions about how policy should ideally operate, that is, an aligned state. And that sits really uncomfortably with how federations actually operate, and also how many people believe federations should operate. So, for example, alignment might be alluring or seductive to those who believe it's indeed possible to align systems to evidence-based practices. But those sort of attempts to align things clearly pose challenges for federal systems in which responsibility for schooling resides at the subnational or state level, and in which the capacity for state autonomy is enshrined. So the aims of alignment, I guess, I'm suggesting, and my interviews that I'll canvass will show this, the aims of alignment, I argue, sit in tension with the traditions of decentralisation, competition, autonomy and diversity, which is central to the design of federal systems. And linked to that, I think what's interesting is that notably absent in debates for policy alignment is consideration of the benefits of misalignment, or the benefits of messier policy processes, which have long been understood as potential benefits of federal systems rather than roadblocks to more effective governance. And indeed, purposeful forms of misalignment are often articulated within federalism theory as protective strategies against uniformity, or protective strategies against the potential for a federal government to have bad ideas that states might want to avoid rather than align with, which I imagine is a highly prescient concern for many US citizens at the moment. So, as political scientist Adrian Kay has argued, when we focus just on the characteristics of harmonisation, alignment and coordination, often what we do is obscure from view the potential for experimentation, variety and difference in multi-level policy making. And in addition, by treating alignment as a purely technical challenge in the pursuit of better policy, arguments for alignment are very often devoid of any critical consideration of those potential dangers, not to mention the kind of social dimensions, the political complexities, or even the cost burdens, if you put it that way, of trying to align different policy processes and content. Finally, there's also, and this is important for those interested in school improvement, there's also limited evidence in many cases that alignment will actually deliver on its promises. So, for example, ongoing arguments in favour of policy alignment rarely acknowledge that major attempts to align policies, particularly through standards-based reform, often have failed to deliver many of the promised improvements in schooling. And in some cases, as I'll argue, they've actually produced unintended consequences or made things worse. So in Australia, we've had a vast array of national standards-based reforms, but after a decade, attempts to align processes through these reforms have failed to achieve nearly every one of the claimed benefits for pursuing alignment in the first place. And in cases where, supporters of alignment recognise this limited impact, they tend to put the blame on a failure to fully align or properly align, rather than recognising that maybe alignment itself wasn't the silver bullet that it was sort of originally framed as being. So, look, I'll stop talking about alignment in a second, but before I do, just let me say, I don't think we should be surprised by the focus and the limits of alignment that I've drawn attention to here, given the etymology of the word alignment, which actually traces back to the late 18th century. So alignment evolved from the French term aligner, which basically means to line things up. In subsequent centuries, though, we saw alignment take on a second meaning, which related to the process of adjusting or arranging component parts in proper relative positions. And so before I go on to talk about my interview data, I just want to say that I see both of these definitions or meanings infusing current debates around schooling. So, for example, on the one hand, we have contemporary debates for alignment resting on an assumption that the kind of proper position that actors and organisations should inhabit is one centred on collaboration, shared strategic thinking, common goals, and so on. But at the same time, these debates clearly privilege alignment between policy content, metrics, and so on and so forth. And they privilege the production of commensurable data in areas where data can't currently be lined up for comparison. And this is seen as necessary to tell us what works. So in both cases, there's a privileging of technical rationality, which essentially treats policy components almost like puzzle pieces or cogs in a machine that need to be properly rearranged to allow the whole to function in more streamlined and effective ways. So in a second, I'll turn to some of my interviews to show that many of these issues are actually playing out right now in the Australian Federation. But before I do that, let me say a few things about Australian schooling policy and why I think it's such an exemplary case for examining policy alignment. So I mean, like the US, Australia is a federation in which state governments are responsible for schooling. The past decade in Australia, though, has seen unprecedented attempts to align policies, align processes, and also goals at the national level. So since the late 2000s in particular, the federal government has played a dramatically increased role in driving and incentivising financially a national school reform agenda. And as a result of that, in a very short space of time, Australia's gone from having no major national reforms in core areas of schooling to having a vast array of national reforms, including a national curriculum, national testing, national teaching standards, a national website called the My School website, which reports standardised data on every school in the country. We have a national schools interoperability program, which is seeking to harmonise data across systems. We have a national measurement framework for schooling, which outlines key performance targets that states have to work towards. I could go on, but in every case, these reforms have been underpinned by an argument that better aligning state schooling systems will indeed improve outcomes, ensure greater equity of provision, and also tackle a whole range of issues like the ones I mentioned earlier, overlap, duplication, inconsistencies, and so on. Now, the reality of Australian federalism has meant that these national reforms have had to emerge through quite complex and often contested processes, of intergovernmental collaboration. So reform has relied, to make it happen, this has relied not only on those technical means I mentioned earlier, so aligned policies and content, but also on new forms of intergovernmental alignment or social alignments, which have brought different actors and agendas and organisations together into a new national policy assemblage. And, this has included a broad array of different initiatives, declarations, agreements, processes. I can't stress enough, though, that all of these processes have been strongly promoted by successive federal governments, which have financially incentivised and sought to steer national reforms in particular directions. And this is possible because of Australia's high level of vertical fiscal imbalance, which basically means that the federal government has much higher revenue-raising capacity through taxation. And over time, state governments have become progressively reliant upon the federal government to help fund expensive social services like education. And as a result of this, we've seen major federal funding increases in schooling, but these have been conditional upon state support for federally backed national reforms. In addition to that, which is sort of intrinsically linked to it, we've also seen the federal government be a major force in driving the development of new organisations that have been designed to either develop national reform or to work with states to co-design new national policies. So just two examples here. One is the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, which I'll refer to as ACARA. And ACARA developed the Australian curriculum. It's had a major role in national testing, and it manages the national My School website, along with the various other responsibilities. And another major organisation is AITSL, which is the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership. AITSL developed the national teaching standards and has also just developed, working with other stakeholders, a teacher performance assessment linked to the standards. So both those two organisations, ACARA and AITSL, they've both assumed major policy development powers at the national level, but in areas of state responsibility. And both of them are financially supported by the federal government, but with an important difference, which is that ACARA is co-owned by all governments, so federal, state and territory, but it's 50% funded by the federal government, with the remaining 50% shared amongst the states and territories. AITSL, however, is responsible for developing national policies in the area of teaching standards, but AITSL's fully owned and funded by the federal government. And as I'll argue in a moment, this federal ownership has major implications, particularly for state-level departments and agencies. So to cut a long story short, the past decade of reform in Australia has seen complex new national networks emerge to develop major new national policies, all of which have had policy alignment as a central aim. But, as I've said, these new national forms operate under the shadow of the federal government's authority. And many state-level policy actors, as I'll now argue, see these arrangements as a mixed blessing. Because on the one hand, attempts to better align things have generated some new possibilities, but they're also leading to confusion. These reforms are leading to some confusion over roles, over responsibilities, and in some cases are producing new forms of misalignment. Right, so as I've said up to this point, essentially what I've done in this half of the presentation just gone is to get you to think about and problematize the concept of alignment and policy alignment, particularly within federations. I now want to spend a little bit of time looking at the research that I've done, which, as I said, involved a number of interviews with senior sort of top-level policymakers within Australia, with a particular view of 4 case study states that I looked at. So in doing this work, my key question really has been, how are state policy actors interpreting policy alignment, and how are they engaging with debates about it? And also how are they responding to it? So, in asking those sorts of questions, It's been really interesting for me because overall, two very clear themes have come out of those interviews. But what's interesting about those themes, and as we argue in the paper, they, on a surface level at least, seem kind of paradoxical or in tension with each other. Let me explain. So, on the one hand, a very clear theme that came through in the interviews was that policy actors, they very strongly identify with debates about policy misalignment. So when I was talking to them, they articulated multiple examples of different types of misalignment within Australian schooling. They expressed particular concern about the implications of policy development and decision-making increasingly taking place at the national scale, as I mentioned earlier, and with significant federal influence, while the implementation and the accountability and the responsibility for schools remain at the state level. So in their view, they were in increasingly difficult positions because they only had partial influence over shaping the national level reform, but they remain fully responsible and accountable for how those policies were enacted. So in other words, there was a partial decoupling of development on the one hand and implementation on the other hand. And this was seen as a really powerful factor in creating new misalignments between federal, state and national policies. And so as you can imagine, like these, given what I've said about the Australian Federation, these concerns were mainly expressed in relation to the federal government's influence and also the work of that curriculum organisation and assessment organisation, ACARA, and the teaching standards organisation, AITSL. So people had these concerns despite the fact that ACARA is co-owned by all governments. And they also had these concerns despite the fact that all national reforms have emerged from intergovernmental agreements. So it's important to mention here, I guess, that policymakers generally, at the state level, generally supported the kind of broader principles of national reform. Like they were for equity, they were for improving quality, but most felt that policy development processes had been increasingly dominated by the federal government, but the federal government was seen as lacking experience and authority over schooling. So just to give you an example, a policy actor from the state of Victoria said to me that, because national reforms are so federally driven, state agencies now feel like they have one arm tied behind their back because they can only partially control policy development processes, but have no choice but to deal with the impacts and fallout of implementation. A Victorian policy actor said something very similar and said, if you're not in control of the levers, then it's very hard to be fully responsible and accountable for the performance. And so a policy actor from New South Wales, another one, also said that national reforms, in their view, were about getting the states to do things, but without the federal government having any responsibility for making sure they got done. So you can see a kind of theme emerging here. As you might expect, the AITSL, because it was fully federally owned, came under extreme criticism in this regard because it was seen as federally controlled and essentially developing national policies that states were told that they had to align with. One New South Wales policy actor spoke at length about AITSL, suggesting, they devise these policies and processes, but they don't do any of it. They're developers, they're not implementers. And, another person in New South Wales made the same distinction, saying you can't create policy where the accountabilities are at another level of government. Another key issue that was raised by state policy actors was what they described as an unfortunate blend of political short-termism and also micromanagement as a result of seeking to implement federal government agendas through national reforms. So policy actors pointed, for example, to various ways that national reforms hinged on federal agendas or federal budget cycles that didn't always align or rarely aligned with state budget cycles, plans, contexts, and so on. So the problem here was a bit different. It was sort of one of temporal misalignment. So the federal funding of schools, for example, was often used as an example in this regard, with a lot of examples given about how both the federal funding of schools on an ongoing basis, but also short-term funding initiatives, generated misalignments with state policy contexts and reforms. So a Victorian policy actor said to me, for example, that the Commonwealth funds programs, but then those programs run out. And then they said, states then have to kind of scramble to align with the new federal agenda, and then they find the agenda ending, and then they're left in the lurch. And so this sort of churn of misalignment between federal and state cycles. They also said that, which is closely linked to this, that national reforms sometimes produce misalignments between national policy directives and state legislative requirements. And so what I mean by this is that, essentially the main concern here was that ACARA and AITSL would have a leading role in creating national policy, but those national policies couldn't align. It was impossible that they would align well with all the different state level contexts and settlements taking place. And, one policy actor said to me, you got to draw a line between the principles and the realities of national reform. And they talked about how, on paper at least, national reforms like a national curriculum or national teaching standards on paper reflected national unity. But in reality, these processes were dominated by the federal government in ways that butted up against what states were actually trying to do. So one policy actor in New South Wales, spoke at length about this and said, the federal government was perceived to be working through ACARA and working through AITSL to sometimes sort of circumvent state agendas and legislative requirements. And when I asked them to give me an example of this, they said that, an organisation like ACARA or AITSL, would develop policies. Then through their websites, they'd publicly release information about policies at the national level. And then there'd be, for good reason, there'd be communication, forms of guidance, resources for schools and teachers and so on that are linked to the national policy. But then, the point that this person was making was that those communications about national policies would go directly to schools and go directly to teachers. So they'd go around the state bureaucracy straight to the school level. And then school leaders and teachers would become confused about which curriculum or which teaching standards they should be following, because what had happened was a lot of states haven't just adopted the national version in a clear and same fashion. They've actually adapted and adopted elements of it into kind of state-based versions. So to go back to New South Wales, they have a New South Wales version of the curriculum, which is sort of the same, but also sort of different from the national curriculum. So the New South Wales version is what teachers in that state should be doing and what schools should be following, rather than the national version on the ACARA website. So you can see how, if you're a teacher in a school or a school leader, you could become confused about what it is exactly you're supposed to be following. So, some people I've spoken to about this say, well, these are unavoidable issues in federations, in which national and subnational governments both contribute to core policy areas. But I think what's important to emphasise in the Australian case is that the people I spoke with at the state level saw a lot of these issues as being exacerbated by attempts to forge greater alignment and consistency at the national level. So, in other words, while recent reforms have been driven by desires to better align things, policymakers saw these attempts as, in some cases, generating new misalignments, which either fueled existing tensions or created new ones. So, as I've said, the multiple kind of policy actors got the idea of alignment. They got the problem of misalignment, and they articulated it in all those ways I've just suggested, plus more. The other major theme, though, that came out of my research, which is really interesting, I think, is that even though they articulated all those types of misalignment, they didn't necessarily see alignment as the solution. So, in fact, the idea of clearly aligning roles and responsibilities or processes and content was not always seen as possible, nor was it seen as necessarily desirable. So somewhat paradoxically, while misalignments were much maligned, attempts to make things align were seen as often unrealistic or not a good idea. There was also a broad acceptance amongst state actors that certain levels of muddiness concerning roles, responsibilities, content and processes were actually inevitable features of federalism, and in some cases were positive features. So, there was someone in Western Australia, one of the policy actors there, said to me, it's always going to be blurred at the edges. Or as a New South Wales policy actor said, mismatches, frictions, these are hallmarks of the way schooling operates in a federation. Policy actors also frequently raised the issue of overlap and duplication. But again, not only between federal and state overlap, but they also talked a lot about national and state overlap, which is a really crucial distinction, which you might want to sort of discuss in more detail in your own work. Overlap and duplication were seen as problems in some cases, but they were also described as often positive features. And many said, we shouldn't eradicate overlap and duplication. So a common narrative here was that, as we've seen a kind of increased presence of the federal government and national organisations, which had led to some increased overlap and duplication, the idea that we should just try and erase all that and then align everything was seen as quite dangerous. And this was because while some forms of duplication were seen as wasteful, others were seen as actually necessary and appropriate to protect state autonomy. So, a New South Wales policy actor said that, the trend towards states and adopt the idea that states would adopt and adapt major national policies rather than just doing them meant that they could implement reforms in a state-specific and what they said was an appropriate way. And they didn't see that as wasteful duplication, but they saw that as value-adding and as actually an important step of developing policy in a local way, even if it works against the aims of policy alignment. And this policy actor said to me, this New South Wales policy actor said, there's actually now an increased need for overlap and duplication, given the extent to which national reforms have been driven by the federal government. So in other words, because reforms are seen as federally dominated, the states saw that they needed to assert authority through adapting and adopting approaches to state context. There's another person in New South Wales made a really similar point, saying that, sometimes overlap and duplication are quite helpful and provide benefits that are beyond the apparent savings. And they said, the work we do shouldn't just take and repeat what federal and national agencies are doing, but should add value to it. And they saw this as necessary in order to, ensure that states didn't just collapse everything they did into a national approach. Another common argument that was levelled against alignment was in terms of the time and the resources and the costs that were seen to be incurred by states in order to bring state processes into line with national reforms. So several policy actors, for example, said that when they were considering the benefits of engaging in a national reform, states would have to consider the trade-off between what they might positively gain from the reform against what it would cost the state to put that reform into practice. So national reform was only seen as being worth it if the gains outweigh the effort. So one Victorian policy actor, was talking to me at length about this and sort of saying, we have these reams of paper, these ministerial briefings, hundreds of public servants involved in trying to bring state and national processes into alignment. And they suggested that these efforts to align things are not always worth it when the gains are mild or even questionable, or the attempts to align don't produce any of the benefits that have been claimed. So, a Tasmanian policy actor I spoke to said, is it worth the pain or not to try and align things? And they talked about that in terms of a kind of value proposition. So on this point, I think these sorts of comments, they help explain why national reforms have to date required such significant levels of federal funding and incentivisation to gain traction with the states. But then the flip side to that is that these significant levels of federal funding and associated conditions have also fueled perceptions of federal overreach. So there's a kind of complex double-edged sword at play here, because state policy actors suggest the alignment of policy and processes is only worth it if the money's good enough, but then the conditions that end up being attached to financially attractive reforms lead to concerns about state authority being threatened by federal domination. So in a way, like, you could sort of think about this as a case of state policy actors wanting to have their cake and eat it too. So, we want to take the money, but we don't always want to align with what the agenda is. But I also think that this points to a deeper or more fundamental limit with arguments that see alignment as feasible as an aim in a federal system. So let me conclude all of this and just offer a couple of final thoughts to synthesise what I've been trying to argue. So I started today by sort of outlining how I've been trying to problematise policy alignment. And I've suggested that, arguments in favour of alignment tend to suffer from a number of limits, even at a theoretical or conceptual level. These limits and the ways in which alignment is talked about grate uncomfortably against the principles and design of federal systems. And in particular, I argued that, alignment thinking or pro-alignment thinking tends towards erasing from view forms of disorder or misalignment that might prove to be incapable of being aligned. So another way of putting this is that by making alignment visible, making alignment and misalignment visible as problems and solutions, other ways of seeing alignment and misalignment are kind of pushed out of the equation. And that includes the potential benefits of misalignment, fragmentation, decentralisation, or forms of what I've been calling productive disorder. Having done that, I tried to show very briefly how some of the policy actors I interviewed saw multiple tensions at play in the Australian Federation as a result of attempts to forge alignment in schooling. Now, while policy debates clearly favour the pursuit of alignment within Australia, the interviews I conducted paint a much more complex portrait. I guess they show that while senior policy actors do see misalignment as a problem, they don't necessarily see alignment as the solution. So they see misalignment as a problem, but they don't see alignment as the solution. So I think this raises really complex questions about the logic underpinning arguments for policy alignment, but also about the benefits and the feasibility of pursuing alignment in the first place within federations. I think it also casts doubt over assumptions that suggest national standards-based reforms will improve schooling outcomes and serve as a solution to perennial governance issues in federations. Indeed, Australian reforms have not only not improved key schooling outcomes in areas like equity, student performance and many others, but attempts to further align policy processes, content and goals have in some cases generated new misalignments. So in drawing attention to these dynamics, it hasn't been my desire to simply argue against alignment in all cases or I argue against intergovernmental collaboration or national unity in certain forms. But what I've been trying to do is highlight the limits and assumptions that underpin alignment thinking, and to show that misalignment is not always perceived by policymakers as a problem in the way that current debates suggest, and that policy and research debates frame the problem of misalignment in ways that rest on certain logics and assumptions and make possible certain solutions while obscuring a range of other things. So ultimately, I think we need to move beyond core aspects of alignment thinking, both in policy, theory and practice. And I think moving beyond alignment, what might that look like? Well, I think that there's, as a first port of call, I think there's a need for ongoing critical debate about arguments that suggest the end game of reform should be to forge states of alignment between and within systems. And so I think these arguments rest upon what Jal Mehta has called the allure of order. So I think there's a kind of blind faith that the path to improvement in schooling will come through seeking to standardise and order systems through applying the principles of scientific and rational administration from above. Second, I think there's a serious need for researchers and policymakers to take a more critical stance towards arguments that favour policy alignment, nationalisation and standardisation within federations. So in saying this, again, I'm not suggesting that collaboration or the pursuit of some national goals are negative features, but what I am trying to say is that I'm highly sceptical of claims that the way forward is to overcome differences, to increase commensurability through standardised technologies, and also to reorient all practices in line with kind of evidence repositories that tell us what works. And because I think the pursuit of these sort of aligned states carries significant dangers, as it fails to recognise that federal systems were purposefully designed to avoid such alignments, to guard against bad ideas, to mitigate against widespread policy failure, and to resist authoritarian tendencies. So, look, I think at the end of the day, if we truly believe that common processes, standards, practices, all aligned and linked to evidence that tells us what works, if we truly believe that that will always be the gold standard for reform, then we've got nothing to worry about in terms of policy alignment. But if we recognise that the complex ways in which policy development is kind of infused with political agendas, political objectives, if we think about the partial and imperfect ways that evidence is formulated and the extent to which the formulation of policy problems and solutions reflects networks of power, then we immediately see the dangers at play. So to summarise, rather than pursuing what we might call optimal or aligned policy states, I think we should be thinking about this differently. Perhaps we should start to think about policy less in terms of technical rationality and something that's sort of about the art of the optimal, and instead start to think about policy as a much more complex and socially mediated phenomena, more of a craft than a science, and more of the art of the possible. Thank you.